And that should do it. We are live. Nathan, how are you doing, sir?
Real good. Zach, thanks for having me on. For a long time I heard your name. I was like, Zach D. Rose. I was like, that's a basketball player. Who are you talking about? D. Rose. D.
Yeah.
Rose.
So it's interesting, man. Me and my dad and my brother too were Chicago Bulls fans.
Oh, funny.
So D Rose being Derrick Rose being our best player for a while. I guess when was that? That's like the 2000s, late
Yeah.
2000s.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was good. And now they've got DeRozan on their team too. So it's a we have a fortuitous name for being a Chicago Bulls fans. A fortuitous last name. So
Well, thanks for having me. And, just so the viewers know, Zach and I recently met each other. So this is an exploration unto ourselves.
yeah, yeah. So I guess you and Craigery go back a little bit, right?
Gregory is a good friend. Yes, really just, I was always set back by his approach, his patience. I'm always impressed with people's patience.
Yeah,
And he struck me as someone who had just an immense patience, nice calming presence, really nice to work with.
yeah, for sure. So Craigery is one of our engineers here at NX working on the OSS side of stuff. So helping to manage, I guess some of the stuff we'll see today, just the plugins, which we won't actually live code the plugin because I've done that off stream. So you're welcome because that's maybe a more tedious task. But we'll take advantage of using some plugins and some generators here in the stream. Um, yeah, I see a bunch of folks joining, so welcome y'all. We'll get started here in just a bit. Probably give it a few more minutes, and then we'll jump into kind of what we've done in the past in creating a to-do app, and then what we're going to do today, which is take that React app and make it solid.
We,
So,
we, we should give some context here too, because
sure.
I think, solid is something that is really interesting. It's really compelling. Zach and I both have been experimenting with it. We're kind of learning together. And so it's kind of fun to, try these things out. I mean, I think always in JavaScript, the ability to sort of use things that are available, experiment around and see how things work. And probably more importantly, just being in a space where you can do that, I think is really compelling. Yeah,
Yeah,
talk about the docs. I mean, the docs are like really informative, really good, very clear. I know from my side, I was able to get solid going without any trouble at all.
yeah. I just wanted to highlight this too because I knew that there was a shift in sort of the mental model between Solid and React. Like they're very close, right? Like if you look at this, you don't look too hard. This might look a lot like React, but there's something very interesting going on here, which is there is a set interval happening inside of the closure of our component, not inside of a use effect. So there's clearly something very different going on here. I thought this was like the perfect example that they have. I'm showing on screen here. Maybe I can make that a little bit bigger. But yeah, I thought this example was perfect for them highlighting on their front page. Just there's something a little different going on, right? So
Something nice about the language itself coming at you a bit more directly. Definitely, it's nice.
yeah. Well, there is, I think the idea that a component, like coming from Angular, the idea that a component is a function that gets called on the render cycle was like a very interesting departure because I'm used to having like a context for this stuff to happen. And the context around that component in React kind of gets created around like the combination of bringing all these hooks into play, right? And that was the maybe the hardest thing to make that jump. But solid, and I think quick does something here too, where it's like it's not that the function is something that gets called every render cycle. It's like it's almost as if the function is defining this is how the component is going to behave over time, and that's interesting. I think another interesting piece is like this create signal here Like looking at it coming from a React perspective, you think, okay, this is my use state replacement, right? But then it blows your mind because you could just hoist that out of the context of the closure, and that thing still keeps working fine. So that's like maybe another signal that that there's something maybe a little different going on here too, which is great because like I don't know, I haven't gone deep enough yet, Nathan, into like solid stores. I don't know maybe if you had, but I saw something about that in the guides and the API. But like this ability to create signal and do it anywhere actually like gives me what I need to like construct a store on my own, I think. So
Haven't gotten into stores yet, but I think on Create Signal too, the other thing that sort of stands out there, even against use effect, is if you contrast that with Vue and Angular and the fact that mechanisms, are sort of built in there,
mhm.
it's definitely a stylistic, trait and approach. And I think the contrast is there for dealing with change detection and just those sorts of things. But yeah, like Create Signal, obviously being able to break it out of the closure there is, I think, visually makes sense depending on where you're coming from.
Yeah. Well, the ability to break it out, I mean, that just makes it that much easier to share this kind of store. Like there's sort of like a store, I don't know, context or entity that we're creating that's not confined to the component at this point, which I thought that was really interesting. But
It
yeah, I
also
guess yeah, go ahead.
it also brings up more potential for code sharing,
Yes.
which I think we'll touch on a bit here. Part of I think being able to move and experiment with tech, if you can share mental models around and constructs, makes it a bit more freeing in terms of what you can do creatively. So yeah, definitely those things strike me here.
Killer. Well, let's we're a few minutes in now. Let's go into just like setting some context for what what we'll be trying to do today. So I had mentioned this before, but in a prior live stream that we did with the TRPC team, we actually created I created a generator that will actually create this sort of cluster of 4 applications for us, right? So by running a generator, we'll create a TRPC router. We'll create an Express server over here that will serve as our backend that will use that TRPC router. We'll create a front end app with the generator we made before that was just using React. And we also ended up creating this to do our TRPC client. That was its own sort of node in the library because I had assumed this is probably the way we're going to want to expose the TRPC client, not realizing there's some integrations that we could have done inside of React. So this client, it works. It's just it ended up being unused in the way we addressed things in the live stream last time. But we are going to actually use that TRPC client today because we'll be adding, let me just copy and paste this in here, to do a solid app here. And this will sort of use that client and we'll use that like create signal to create some sort of like store for our to do items. And then we'll probably just like copy and paste a lot of the TSX and stuff going on inside of the React app because, we'll be able to share a good amount of that. So yeah, and I guess to create this node here too, I did some work off stream on creating a solid app generator. And we can maybe look at that here real quick. Coming into VS Code, this is the NX graph, so maybe a recreation of what we just did on our little whiteboard here.
I was going to say, and stepping back for a moment,
Yeah,
the stream you did the other week going into TRPC, this picks up on some of those pieces. Just to give a backdrop for those who may not have seen that, the TRPC app. I don't know if you want to touch on that just briefly,
sure.
so some don't get lost there. But the nodes that you have here thus far are this workspace where you put together a TRPC client, a server piece. There's a React web app that builds on top of that. But yeah, just showing what we have here, I think,
Yeah.
and what we'll add in and how.
Yeah, exactly. So this is without touching anything. This is just serving the React application that we had built the last time. So I can maybe jump into our to-do app. Let me make that a little bit bigger. Not the flashiest of apps, right? But if we look over here, we can see if we add a to-do item, this is going across the wire and adding our to-do item to the backend store, and that's being kind of constructed on the front end side so we can mess around with things. If I refresh, it's still there. If I were to open a new tab on the localhost port, we can see it's still there too. So essentially what we did is we fast tracked our way into creating a full stack application. And like we had mentioned, the generator did, whoops, let me undo that. The generator ended up doing most of our work because it created all this stuff for us. All we had left to do, and that made it so that we could actually just have that one command to serve everything too. And so all we had left to do at that point was to just implement the functionality. So I think it was a really good example of NX being there in the background, giving us a lot of value without us even necessarily knowing that it was there, aside from like using the generator to call it.
And
But yeah.
you wrote these generators, to be clear. Yeah, like the generators you're referring to, there's a lot of generators out there
Mm-hmm.
to use, to do all sorts of things. These generators you're talking about. Thanks, Brandon, for joining us. The generator you're talking about is something you wrote with the Norwal dev kit. To kind of touch on that, I don't know if you want to show that just real quick, because
Sure.
I know for like our team, we use a lot of these generators ourselves. Depending on the case, internal workspace like generators are really useful. They come in handy largely when you have specific domain rules, for your organization that you want everyone on the team to stick to. It could be small points from component level setups to the bootstrap of an app to common resources that are set up and the way you want to configure that. These generators can definitely help kind of bring a set of consistency to the whole organization that way. So you created this generator to roll up this specific setup, and this is not
Yes, exactly.
required, but you did this, of course, just to illustrate um, how to do something like that.
Yes. So the idea here was we would actually, a lot of the existing first party generators that NX supports actually gets us most of the way there. And we can actually see that here inside of the code. Like if you see what's on screen, what I actually did to create this was I manually went through and like ran a few generators, as we can see here. Ran the React app generator, ran the generator to set up Tailwind for that React app, and then created a Node app, and then created a couple more JavaScript libraries using the Narwhal JS generator. And then after that, there's just like a couple files to touch. I created a function for each one of these that just ended up doing the touching for me. So I wouldn't actually have to do any of that manual stuff. And what we have is actually like this really readable like laundry list of what we could do to get us to a starting point really quick. And so this was we see on screen here, this was the generator to run the TRPC app. And this is to make this cluster of 4 libraries right here. But in preparation for today's exercise, I created a new Solid plugin here. And we can see there is a generator inside of the new Solid plugin that I created. And it's doing something very similar here, where we actually, my starting point for our Solid application was to first generate a React application, which was interesting. But because we're using Vite as our bundler, we actually create inside of our first party React generator most of the stuff we would need to bundle and to serve and do all the things we need to with a Solid application, and including, I was surprised to find setting up Tailwind. We can actually just set up Tailwind the exact same way because of the way the app gets bundled. And then if we look at what I'm doing next, there are a couple things that we have to adjust to set up for Tailwind. For example, here we're touching the Vite config that ends up getting generated. And here we have to use the Solid plugin from the Vite plugin Solid package. I think this was actually something you had showed me, Nathan, from the branch you had sent me when we were prepping for this.
So I was
But
going to say, yeah, if I'll step in here for a minute. I think the generators for new people who are sort of looking at this, I think the generators is something that can throw people off. Generators are optional. Obviously, Zack chose to do that here in this case. On my end, when I did this, I didn't use a generator. I actually used directly from Solid's docs the digit command to generate a Solid app. I just generated that standalone project and then brought that directly into NX. Literally just drag and dropped it in the apps. And from there, looked at the pieces of Solid that, could be broken down,
mhm.
and one of those things is immediately is the package, because when you're bringing any outside app, especially NPM based, into NX, you usually can drop the package JSON. There's some cases where you may not want to do that, but typically you can drop the package JSON because you can drop all the versions to the root, kind of following that single versioning approach. And then the Vite executor, or Vite, I always get that. What do you prefer, Zach?
I did French growing up, so Vite makes sense to me.
Okay, let's
I
go with
think
Vite.
Primogen was actually talking about this recently too. He refused to say Vite; he says Vite because that's how
I,
you
I
would say
like
it in English.
I
And
like
I
Vite better for some reason.
you can say that.
Um,
I'm fine. I'm not
it,
particular.
at any rate, there's an executor already for React that's in the Norwal executors that works for Solid,
Hmm.
and I didn't know that beforehand. I just used what was available there, and it just worked. The only thing that was needed, as he's pointing out in this generator, is the Solid plugin
Exactly.
um, being referenced there, and the Vite or VTS config paths right there is really just to configure the fact that we are inside of this particular folder because we're not running it as a standalone app. Outside of those two things, everything worked. The
Yeah.
configuration of it is
Yeah. I think
completely
there was
interoperable.
maybe a couple of things I needed to touch in here as well, like the index.html. I guess this was mainly, pulling from stuff. I guess I'm coming from the starting point of the React generator that reran. So I just kind of like clobbered what had been in there and replaced it with this. I guess the interesting things are in adding the script to make sure that our index.tsx file is there and imported. And inside of that index.tsx file, which we can see right below, we just have like a little boilerplate from Solid to get things started and then to render our app component here.
And
Um,
that's direct from Solid Docs. I don't know if you want to go to Solid Docs and
sure.
um, just illustrate, or do they show the index? They may just show the component there.
Yeah, I don't
But
know.
when you generate the app under Try Solid, yeah, when you generate there with Digit, that structure has that index, and it's exactly what he's showing there.
Yeah, I'm not. I actually hadn't gone into the playground before. Is there a way to see like the file system? What's going on?
Not as familiar with that either, but
My key bindings aren't working, so I'm guessing it's not available.
yeah, I mean, I
That's
think
okay.
the important part there though is that this is a stock Solid app.
Hmm.
It's directly generated from the docs. Zack is just using a built-in generator to kind of streamline the generation setup of it in here. But again, from my end, I didn't do this. Um, we both took different approaches in working with Solid in X, and I took a more just manual ad hoc approach, just drop the app in and then looked at what was there as far as what can be shared and broken down, and
Right.
was delighted that it just worked. Um, So
Yeah.
yeah,
That's the best part is it just worked.
it did.
Yeah, I think the one thing we may not have noticed, or you may not have noticed going from your part too, was the TS config actually the way the JSX worked. I was getting some interesting errors in my IDE initially because obviously starting from a React starting point, the JSX was I think using like React JSX, so just switching it to use this solid JSX syntax here kind of solved all these
JSX
problems.
import source, definitely an important setting. Yeah, I
Yes,
learned
for
that as
sure.
well. Got to have that.
Yeah. I think like aside from that, like that's essentially it's just automating all the steps that I did. So let's go ahead and run this generator so that we can create our like to do solid app. So right now we see the to do web, that's our React application. But let me clobber that and clear it out. Make sure everyone can see stuff still. Yeah, that looks good. So I'll go ahead and run the generator that we created. So actually I'll use the NX console because that's always nice to use. So we can run generate here and we'll create a whoops, solid app. Oh, I actually don't see our stuff in here yet. I may need to run a reload on the window. Let's see if that helps. Yeah, there we go. So now we can see our
That,
solid app generator here
that
in the
that's a
list.
that's a good point, by the way, with generators. I actually just ran to that a couple days ago because I was writing some new workspace generators, and yeah, I had to reload VS
Yeah,
Code for it to show up. So definitely a good note if you're writing generators, and even if you're making a change to like the schema JSON where you're modifying the properties, um, reload the window for those to show up,
yeah,
especially if you're using like NX console.
yeah. Most of the time, though, unless you're me, yeah, I don't think you end up writing these generators too often. So it's not that big of a pain point. I think for most folks, but yeah. There we go. We can see these are kind of the options available to us in creating our solid app. So we're going to give it the name of to do solid, and they'll give us a dry run here first. So this is going to preview everything the generator is going to do before we do it. And we can see it's just creating a bunch of stuff inside of apps to do solid. So I'll hit run here to make those actually happen. And there we go. You can see source control jump to 15 over here. And I think if we can jump into our index.html, maybe our index.tsx is more interesting. We can kind of see things here. And if I jump to, I guess I can reuse one of those windows, but let's make sure we got something going on here. Oh, I didn't start the app. That's probably a good step to run. So let's go up. And yeah, we're going to run serve full stack to do solid. And I think that should do it. There we go. Hello to do solid. We've got it.
And had you run it there again just to see the command? Yeah, anything.
Sure.
One thing I do really like is just run anything the same way. I love structured run commands. There's anything that drives me nut in working workspaces typically is if there's sort of all these different sort of unclear ways to run things. And
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple ways we could do this. I know you like being clear, like you just mentioned, but there's a couple of ways we could have done this. But we're using the serve full stack target for our to do solid application. Now is what's going on here, and we can see if we jump into the project.json file here, if we collapse our targets, we should see at the bottom here there is a serve full stack. So this is creating a target, defining a target for our to do solid application. And it's saying which executor should we use. We're actually using the executor the same one that we were using actually for the React one, which will allow us to serve both our front end project here and our back end project in one single serve. And this executor is actually also what's giving us those nice presets with the little colors on them. So if I were to open up my terminal, we can see this is kind of how it maps through, where the to do solid matches our application name, and the serve full stack matches the target name here inside of the project JSON. And
So
we could, yeah,
yeah, I
go
was going to
ahead.
say an alternate way you can do nx run and run the project name itself and then colon the target.
Yeah, let's maybe do that. So we could say nx run, and then to do solid colon, and this would be serve full stack. So this is just like an alias for what we would have done if we had run it the other way, but hit that and ends up running the same way. So that's cool. Maybe too, an interesting thing to point out is if you see, because we're using the NX console plugin inside of our project JSON here, we also have these nice buttons just interwoven into our JSON. So I can actually click this, and that will go out and run the same thing for us.
And you can see it ran the same command. I think it's a good way to learn commands too.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you come into an organization that has a large workspace and just trying to understand what is available to run, going through either the project JSONs and invoking them from NX console. Yeah, there's the clear command. So, if you don't want to go through navigation or even use the console to do that, you can find the commands pretty easily.
Yeah. And these things operate just fine too with package scripts. So you'll see here we kind of had our npm start here. This was mapped to our React application here, but I could just paste in the thing I had just grabbed there. Probably need an npx in front, but this way too, if we cancel this out, we can also just run npm start. Wouldn't even know we're using an X now unless we're paying more attention. But that may be something most people are more used to, is if they just start up a app, or once they clone something down, they just install dependencies and then run npm start. I think that's maybe the expected use case for most folks coming into a new app. So totally fine to interrupt with those as well.
So what do we have here, Zach? We got a React app. There's a Solid app. What parallels do we have here?
Yeah, so I think what we can do, because we want to recreate our to-do app in Solid as well, let's maybe look at what's going on in the to-do web app, and we can start pouring this stuff over. So maybe looking at the app.tsx file first. We did end up using the query client here from TanStack React Query, where I think we're actually going to want to skip that for right now, just because when I was labbing this out, the integration didn't seem quite there yet from the TRPC Solid package that was available. So rather than use that client, I think we'll use the to-do client, to-do TRPC client here. Oops.
And just to backfill there a bit, TanStack has a Solid query client and a React query client, and they both work just fine. I think more what we're looking at here is sort of shareable structures between the two. If you were going to experiment with either direction, what you could use of existing code and make that work.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll end up using this client, and then we'll just recreate. You can see there's really just the two components that we created here in React, the form and the to-do list. I think maybe let's start by opening up the to-do list, and we'll kind of make a port of this. So I'm just going to grab all and copy it. This may irk some people right now, but we'll start there, and I'll just drop into the source file here. We'll make a new to-do list.tsx.
I mean, that's a good point on approaches. I think there's a lot of approaches in sharing code, and how you go about it. I mean, what Zach just did there is really, honestly, an effective way too. It'll allow you to see what is and what isn't pretty quick, to where you can more easily kind of break it down instead of doing more piece by piece. But I haven't found one right or wrong way. It's just the approach that works best for you.
Right. Well, there's going to be some things here from what we pasted in that just aren't going to work, partly because we're not using like TanStack like we mentioned. So I'll start here maybe by creating our client first. So we'll say here's a client, and we'll create our to-do TRPC client. So if we look at this, that was just importing from the file we were just looking at. So this is going to create a client based off of our TRPC router. And this is all stuff we had created before, but as we had seen, excuse me, maybe in this diagram, the idea is we're pretty much just swapping out one node, the React node, with the other one. So we should be able to reuse everything going on in these two nodes specifically inside of our backend. And since we already have the client, we're using that. And yeah, let's go from there. So jumping back to our to-do list inside the Solid app, we have our client. And I think I'm actually going to do outside of here just a constant to-dos and our set to-dos. And that's going to create a signal, and we can import from to-do our to-do interface here. Let's make sure we got that right. To-do should be importable. Well, it actually might not be. Let me jump over to our backend side of things. So this would be in I think it would be like in the index.ts for the TRPC server. Here's our interface for to do. I think we'll just need to export that here. Export to do from, and here this will be coming from lib. Nope. Lib. I think that's right. Okay, looks good. Right. And now import to do our to do interface from should maybe be able to reuse that.
There you go.
There you go. That looks good.
The common outage of tsconfig resolution.
Yes, exactly.
What I always like to do in those cases is the shift command P, restart TS server if you need to. Yeah, can often help, especially when you're exporting new symbols and moving things around.
Creating new apps is a good other use case for it, for sure. But I guess the next step, so we kind of got our signal here. So this will be where we'll store our to-dos, and we'll get a way of changing those to-dos. I guess the next step is to have a way of sort of fetching them. So I can just do something here where we call it fetch to-dos, and inside of this we'll say our data. I think Copilot is coming in, but we want to take out of here, and we want to get, and then we want to query. And then inside of the query, I actually don't think we need anything just because of the way things were set up. And it's really nice to get those red lines around that stuff to confirm that that's actually what's going on with the client here, with this client being completely type safe and based on the same code that we did to make our actual backend router. But now, yeah, we have a little method here to go and fetch our to-dos. So I think go inside of our to-do list, we'll want to remove some of this stuff and instead have this go out and on mount. So we'll kind of use that hook to call our fetch to-dos method, our fetch to-dos function here. And inside of what we'll return inside of our templating here, I think we'll just take this from our to-dos and oh yes, we need to call that. now. Don't need the key anymore. And I think that actually gets us most of the way for writing our list. I think there's something more we'll need to do inside of the to-do item, which is, well, I mean, I suppose we can actually remove most of this stuff because this is all based on the TRPC query clients and the utils based around there. But our to-do item, so as we can see, our list is just a ordered list, or an unordered list rather, of these to-do item components. And we'll need to adjust some of this stuff because we don't have some of the functions available to us. But
It's a good moment to look at the syntax. Yeah,
yeah,
difference. And I think you always want to be careful too, certainly with red squigglies, in VS Code, to make sure that it's not, something stale. But it looks like default checked maybe something that's not available there. The on-click syntax is the same between React and Solid there. HTML4 on the label. I don't know if we ran it with that. We could try it and
yeah,
see if we have that available. But might be some small semantic things like that to check.
right.
But this is where it's always interesting to take an approach and set up from, one flavor to the next and see how things pair out.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think default checked, this is actually React specific, which is why it had worked for us before, but won't anymore. And I think we could just use regular checked here because we're using Solid. Inside of onClick, before we had this toggle function that we were creating via the React query stuff, I guess. So I'll change this around a little bit. So we'll just use our client directly. So we already have our client here. And this looks right. Toggle to do. Is this, did I misspell that? Toggle complete was the name.
There we go.
And then is this, yeah. It's very interesting how Copilot was able to figure out, definitely knew what I was trying to do, but it wasn't hooked into the LSP. It's so weird to me.
I don't know if it's recommended to use Copilot when you're kind of going from one semantic structure to another, but
Yeah.
it might cause you more pain.
That's a good point, actually, because I think it actually is doing a lot of stuff based off of stuff you've recently touched and files you've recently opened. So the fact that we're thrashing, or I think we're just essentially thrashing it between, hey, this is React stuff over here, this is Solid.
That's where the
maybe
human
throwing
brain
it.
understanding is definitely always going to do you a favor.
For sure. But yeah, I think we actually want to await that mutate, and then we'll call fetch to dos following that. And the fetch to dos again, it's just here to get all of our to dos and to set them inside of our signal.
And Zach, you're moving pretty fast through this. I mean, for most people, going through this, if they were going to try something from one flavor to the next, definitely move much slower, and it's fine. And obviously some prep beforehand, experimentation yesterday on some of this stuff is allowing Zach to move a bit faster. So don't let the speed of what Zach's doing intimidate you.
Maybe I'm just fast. I don't know.
Going pretty fast.
But yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, I think that would go ahead and get most of our stuff set up for on our checkbox here. Whenever we toggle that, we'll go ahead and send the toggle signal back to our backend server. As we can see, we're setting our checked property on side of that input to match what's coming in from the complete. So essentially just setting all this stuff based on what we're getting, again, because all of this is sourced from our to-dos signal here. So yeah, I guess we can keep going through with what's going on inside of this list item. Like you had mentioned, like HTML4, I think that's probably a React specific thing. And the theme seems to be that most of the stuff that you need, like HTML to prefix, I think we could probably just replace that with regular for, and that seems to work.
I
So
love when natural semantics, especially with the DOM, like just come through as
yeah,
they are. This is really nice.
right. And well, the reason for this too, maybe we could look it up out on MDM, but the MDM checkbox, MDen, ooh, interesting. The way to do an accessible checkbox here, so we can see, is when we have an input, you should set an ID and then have a label for it that will use the for attribute here to tie these things together. And what this will do is if we click anywhere, if we click on the box, it'll obviously switch. But what the for enables us to do is we can click on the label now. That will toggle our checkbox for us as well. So
It's
that's,
the
yeah,
small things in usage. Hmm.
exactly. And so you can see sort of in our templating here, we're doing the exact same thing where we're just creating a label here and an ID. We're making sure those have the same token so that we can make sure these things are stitched together. And it makes it better for screen readers, makes it better for accessibility. We got all the bases covered. But yeah, the last item we'll need to address here is maybe deleting a specific item from our list. As we can see, we had a function here from the 10-stack query stuff that we had ripped out. So we're going to want to use the client here. I think we can pretty much copy and paste the on click that's going on inside of our checkbox. It's just the endpoint we'll want to call won't be toggle. I think it will just be delete. So I'm going to go ahead and make that change here real quick. I'll paste that over here. And like I said, rather than toggle complete, we can look at the methods we have available to us on our API. And delete looks good. And thankfully, it has the same body that it's expecting. But if we didn't, the red squigglies would come into play. Between the red squigglies and Copilot, we've got ourselves covered if we didn't know what was happening here. And this is the reason I actually really love everything going on with the TRPC stuff. So yeah, we got a message here from Rarish. Need advice. Need to present NX to a bunch of people tomorrow. I would love to know the one thing from NX that people really don't know about, and they totally should. I also need thoughts and prayers. Well, thoughts and prayers, Rarish.
Absolutely.
Hope that everything goes well on the presentation there. It is since becoming more of a someone operating in like the DevRel position, I'm becoming more and more aware of like the real benefit of NX. I think one of the things, Rarish, is just it's just there. And most of the time you don't even realize that it's there because it's doing is sitting in the background, making you 10%, 20%, maybe higher, even more effective at everything you're doing and that much faster at everything you're doing. And yeah, I think that's maybe one of the big selling points of what we're doing here. But yeah, Nathan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think to add to that, is always a good question. I think to ask the team or any group that is considering it is there anything they're doing right now that they're feeling like they're having to double touch?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's like one of the most quintessential questions. And in all cases, in teams we've worked with, there was always that case. It's either a model that's having to be touched in two places. It's a service that's having to be touched in two places. It's a thought process that's having to be thought in two places. And I think that's the most quintessential thing to bring up.
Mm-hmm.
And it can even create a conversation, if you're presenting it in that way, and take that case and look it against the backdrop of NX and that style of development. And I think it's always good to be upfront about the difference, in style, of development, because if you're used to developing singular apps in different, setups, moving into NX, it's good to be upfront that it can take, just a bit to get used to, because it's it's kind of a singular, mental model and approach to the code. And the natural side effect that I think occurs that's nice to mention to the team is it naturally helps the team work together. Whereas, when you're doing it separately, teams tend to splinter off more because you can. Because there's a team's kind of working here on this thing in this thing, and they're only pushing to this thing. And so what they're doing over there is out of sight, out of mind to what this team is doing over there. But usually both of those teams are working together for a singular purpose.
Right.
And so like NX kind of brings them together. And
Yeah.
there's this initial impression that you feel like that is slowing you down initially. And it's sort of more psychological than it is actual. It really speeds you up because everyone gets on the same page with everything, because everything's visible and transparent. You're all working in the same place.
Right. Yeah, I think NX really provides the framework for you to realize, like what you were saying, Nathan, that y'all are all working on the same goal, because you are literally working in the same workspace, and the tooling's all set up there so that you could be easily running these things together. Like I'm doing this thing full stack, right? Our to-do list, it's not that big of a lift, it's it's a simple to-do list, but oftentimes you'd have some team working on a back end and another team working on the front end. And if those things are in two different repositories, especially because that's what a lot of these individual tools are set up to do, is have tooling for one repository over here and another one over here. There's a literal divide in those teams versus in the case of like what workspace are they working on, even versus using NX. They're in the same workspace. Those things are collaborative again, and you are always running their code and their most recent versions of their code, so you can make sure that these things stay in touch, and there's none of that waste that comes in when maybe a verbal contract that you said, hey, the API is going to look like this. It doesn't end up looking like that, or turns out there's some issue that you didn't see when you try to actually put the pieces together. It kind of brings those to the forefront. So
I think the deeper problem too is deployments, like staging deployments.
yeah,
If there's a part of the team that's deploying over here, and yet it was supposed to integrate something another part of the team is doing over here, and there can often be this kind of constant back and forth of, well, this thing wasn't in there. Did you actually push it there? Did you push it here? Who brought this thing in over there? And depending on how big the team is and what the effort is, that can get pretty out of control pretty quick.
for sure. And welcome to the Tarnav. Your avatar
Welcome.
is frightening to me, sir,
Very,
but
very
you're
scary.
welcome. You're welcome all the same.
So
Looks
does
like a
this
fell
work?
orc or something like that.
Does this work, Zach? What you did here, we got solid running here. It's using TRPC and the
Oops.
to-dos that was set up in the React app. Does this actually work?
We can find out. I guess one thing we need to do is adjust our app, because right now, do we have it even running? Yes, we do have it running. And if we go to our Solid app, there's the link for it. I was just looking for a link. Oh, opened it up in a browser window I didn't expect. But if we drop it in here, we still just see the hello to do solid, because that's what we have here. So we'll need to just replace this with our to-do list. And I expect what we'll see is we actually don't have a way of adding anything to this list yet, right? So if we hit a refresh here, we actually see a blank page, but I'm going to go and inspect. I'm going to guess we see like an empty unordered list. Yeah, make that a little bit bigger. So I think this is probably working. And if we check the network tab here too, did I make it so big? I lost. Yeah, there it is. If we check out our network tab and I'll hit a refresh, we can see we actually are requesting our data. Our data is just empty right now, but I think that's pretty solid.
That's pretty solid.
That's pretty solid, bro.
So we got the same network call being made, the same components coming in,
Right.
some small semantic adjustments, and it's actually doing what the React app was doing. Yeah. I don't know if you want to go back to the same list there. Obviously, to-do list is just an unordered list right now. He didn't add the form to add the to-dos, so it's just an empty set of to-dos.
Yeah.
Obviously, we could continue going here and add the other component to add the to-dos that would interact, but we have enough here to show that everything is operational. You know, the database, the network is actually connected. We're interacting with it in the same way. We could take this moment to go one step further and add yet another piece to this, which is to actually render this natively on iOS and Android.
Yeah. Do you want to show us the value of NativeScript there, Nathan? That's
Let's take a look at something here. Let me see if
perfect
I can.
segue. And shout out to Raj here. No, there's still no styles here. Tailwood's set up, so we can style it any way we like. But I am no talent in that arena. So
Zach can use some CSS help out there. Okay, so let me back up. What are we looking at here? Kind of
sure.
looking at same workspace setup that Zach has been showing. He's got a solid app in there. There's a React app here. So just to demonstrate here, this was the React app that we were working with. This is the one that was done from a prior stream hooked up to TRPC. The solid app, which is here, which actually has some similar structures there broken out. What I did in this case is just drop the NativeScript app in and just set it up for solid as well. So if we take a look at that, this is what that looks like. This is returning, in this case, some markup that would actually render this with Android View from the Android docs, and also UI View from
Yeah.
iOS.
Could I ask
And
you what that grid layout is starting on line 17?
grid layout is a UI View set up on iOS, and
Okay.
it is Android View. And for none or for most web developers, these can seem foreign or new concepts, but what we're talking about is this from Android docs. So Android View.view. This is just a structure there. And this is a singular JS primitive that maps that. And it also maps UI View on iOS, which is here from Apple Docs. If we run this, so kind of along the same lines, we can invoke the project name. So in this case, the project name I just have set up as NativeScript Solid to be clear. And then we're going to run the target. So in this case, we have two targets that are set up. We have an iOS target and an Android target. They're using this NativeScript NX executor, which is really just a thin facade on top of the NativeScript CLI. In essence, all it allows it to do is take some options from the command line and then execute those relative to the directory where the app lives. So in this case, we can see it's actually invoking from that NativeScript solid directory, and it's invoking a run on that app. And then what we get here is a solid app on iOS. And a couple interesting things to note down here. So based on what Zach was doing with the TRPC client, we're actually using TRPC and NativeScript. So TRPC, the way that we set it up inside of here is actually to create TRPC solid, which is directly from solid TRPC. We can see the client, the ability to create the client is actually available to us. So these structures are runnable. They're executable. You can wire this up in exactly the same way. Also of note is we're using plain JavaScript. You could use TypeScript in here if you want. You can also use plain JavaScript. I chose to set this up plain JavaScript just for more illustrative purposes, because depending on what you're sharing, like library-wise, we have this TRPC demo scope that's set up in the workspace, and it's sharing out this components library, which is right here. And inside, we're exporting a few things, like we have this TRPC setup, which basically takes any create TRPC client from any particular flavor, whether we're going to create it in React or whether we're going to create it in Solid, and actually creates a reference to that. And then we're exporting that for use. And that's actually what I'm just printing out here in the console, just to demonstrate that the TRPC API is there. And so we could actually, invoke that and interact with it.
Yeah. We have a question here. Is this with Dominative? I have no idea what that is.
Yeah, great question. So it is using Dominative. Dominative is an approach to DOM in NativeScript that was done through community members. There's been a lot of talk of DOM one-to-one compliance in NativeScript for a long time. I would say it's reignited in the past year in terms of taking that even further. And what's driven that is kind of more JavaScript flavors. I think the more innovation that happens in JavaScript, it often always happens on the web, and obviously we're talking DOM there. And
Right.
so with NativeScript, there's always this approach to not create anything extra to make something from the web work. And so Dominative kind of brings a layer of DOM to NativeScript that just allows Solid, as an example, to work, because Solid is interacting with those DOM APIs. So, if I'm just going to run this on Android here, side by side here, just to kind of see what we're dealing with here. And it's really the only reason that the singular JS primitives exist, just to allow you a way to code a singular markup for iOS and Android together. So Android is here. And it's the same thing. We're just loading a image, in this case, loading the Solid logo. When that image is actually loaded, then we just invoke an infinite rotation animation on it. So really simple. But so, Dominative, to answer the question on Dominative, where some of that is going to enable is actually standard HTML div markup inside NativeScript. So very possible in the future, instead of seeing singular JS primitive like grid layout, which is obviously a new concept when you're coming from the web, because it's not something that's in the HTML spec, but would allow you to get away from that, and could actually return a standard DOM there. So you could eventually see something like this, where this would just literally be the DOM, but what it's rendering on the device is actually natural view language on the device, and not HTML markup.
We've caught people's eyes with this. This is really interesting to me. So, I'm sorry. I'm coming from front end web only context. So, I was assuming like what we had before was this grid layout. The reason I asked about that earlier is like, okay, this is obviously a web piece. There's obviously some kind of markup going on for native systems as well, or for the native front end. So I was imagining, the equivalent of a div, and to see you replace that entirely with a div. I guess that's what Dominative is for, is to provide those translations kind of natively or in an integrated way. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's really more to take advantage of the API that the platform provides as is, instead of sort of kind of working around it. So, really the ability to take the view language that's provided by that platform, but use your web approach to interact with it. And NativeScript allows that, and has allowed that for a long time, but there's always been this markup piece to it. And, if anyone talks about new or foreign things in NativeScript, it's that markup itself, because most web developers, when they come in, they're expecting to work with web concepts from start to finish, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where Dominative comes into the picture. Dominative right now is a community effort that kind of adds and works on top of core, but a lot of the discussions lately is actually to bring some of that directly into core, which would remove the need to do another layer on top of core. So core, NativeScript core, what I'm referring to when I say core is this package, this one here.
Mm.
And it's an npm package. It's a JavaScript library that provides these pieces, which are basically registered elements for the runtime that basically correlate to the native view language system.
Very cool. Let me drop a link there in the chat so folks can check it out.
The reason, I think that the DOM discussion is, and I know we're coming up on time. I think
Yeah.
the last thing I'll state there in relative context is that DOM one-to-one is always an interesting discussion in terms of non-web browser context. I think server-side rendering is the most relative thing that comes up to talk about in scope of web developers. Most web developers who have gotten into server-side rendering have encountered that in some form or fashion, which is, server-side rendering is not the browser, so you're sort of rendering it outside of the scope of the browser. And how do you deal with constructs in dealings that are in the DOM that are usually only applicable? Usually that comes down to measuring, things, because the client browser can be any size, so how do you deal with measuring elements in the DOM when you're inside of an environment where you don't know what the user is going to open it up to? So there's nothing to measure against because the user hasn't opened it yet. So that's sort of the interesting discussion of DOM outside of the browser.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's a lot of efforts there. Obviously, Domino being a big one, that allows you to interact with the DOM in sort of a virtual way in the server environment. NativeScript brings a lot of those concepts as well, but it's meshing that up against platform view language.
Right. Maybe maybe to bring it all together, Nathan, before we wrap up, just kind of going back to our original diagram. So it seems like really what I set out to do in creating the solid web app here was creating a new front end inside the context of the workspace. Like there's nothing we did to break the React one. And then it looks like what you've done is create a solid or a to-do solid maybe native app,
Yes.
NativeScript app, maybe even.
It's really accurate to call it a native app. I think
Okay.
a common misnomer with NativeScript is that it's sort of this thing that's kind of unto itself. It's really more behind the scenes in the sense that it's just an iOS and Android app using the natural view language.
Mm-hmm.
It's just adding a layer to allow you to do singular, JS primitives. So at the end of the day, it is an iOS and Android app, and you're using JavaScript to interact with it.
Yeah, and just to be clear too, that native app, it's not maybe not even just a native app because as we saw from your screen, this native app can build to both iOS and Android artifacts, if I'm using the right terms there.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So all of those things are happening inside of the context of our native app, and it looks like between what we were seeing in the grid layout and using Dominative, just using a div instead, that's kind of creating that shared markup between these two things, iOS and Android, so that you could write once and have both platforms supported. Does that? I imagine there must be some friction in there that doesn't always work quite so perfectly in reality, or does it? I don't know.
Yeah, I think with divs, obviously what you can do on the web with a lot of nesting, I think that's where a lot of discussion is occurring, is how much that nesting do you want to auto correlate, for people and combine attributes. Because obviously on mobile devices, you're always dealing with more constrained resources. So you typically do always want to have a cleaner, flatter structure, for best performance, no matter where you're running it. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of things that can be done in terms of, DOM compliance and extrapolation and sort of some nifty things, you could do there with the DOM. Dominative is definitely addressing some of those things, but like I said, more of that may go directly into core. A lot of that discussion is occurring.
That's really cool. Yeah. Well, really neat to see what's kind of going on that side of the world. Like I said, I've been all just web for my entire career. But it's really cool to see how close it could be to jump into native at some point here, especially just leveraging, it looks like, a bunch of the skills that I've been working on and will continue to work on, with this wasn't just a to-do native app. This was a to-do solid native app. So bringing in even those specific new skills I'm working on acquiring could benefit my ability to create one of these native apps at some point in the future. That's really cool.
Yeah, and kind of to bring this back to the start, I think the being in a workspace where you can, work with these technologies, whatever it is, but use your JavaScript approach to do it,
Yeah.
is really, really empowering. And that's kind of what we're kind of exploring here. I think just being able to mix some approaches in, experiment, it's okay to have a team doing it in this approach and another team doing this approach, and share, between them. And there's a lot of effective ways to do that inside of workspace development for sure.
Yeah. Well, you don't see it maybe clearly inside of this diagram that we have, but I think NX is kind of the framework in which all of these nodes can exist. And like you said, create an environment where, these things can be shared, and you can easily, create development environments. So tooling around there, and also the deployment would be a huge piece of this too, where by having all these things in the same workspace, we can tie any kind of deployment flows we have to like launch our new Solid app out to our web server, and simultaneously, have our iOS and Android artifacts go out to match like some change we did somewhere way down at the bottom at our TRPC router to support our new API, some change to our new API. Those could all go out seamlessly together at the same time.
Yeah, but maybe hitting on that or that earlier question about presenting and talking about some benefits there. I think that's a huge benefit. Being able to work at the bottom layer, make a fundamental change, and have that reflected on all your targets. In practice, like, it's easy to talk about that thing, but to do it, can really hit a lot of points. So it's like, it's nice to be in a place where you can do that for real and it really work.
Yeah. Well, like that's in some ways that's what TRPC looks like it's set up to do. Like if we look at TRPC IO, they're on their front page. Like this is what they're demonstrating inside of like their example on their front pages. As soon as you make a change on one thing, this will break, and you'll have instant feedback that it broke. But as we found out before, this was Ahmed creating this screen clip that we see playing in front of us. This is happening in an NX workspace, from what I understood. This is why these two things can be in the same repo and like work so well together, because like we said, there is NX providing this framework for both of those things to live in the same workspace. And now, like building on top of that, today we added the building block of, hey, here's a Solid app that we put on top of this tower that we had. It integrated seamlessly. Didn't break anything. Everything else still works. If we had tests in place, we would have CI processes to confirm that too. And Nathan also came in and showed, hey, it's not just another web framework. It's a whole other platform that we can support, thanks to the work y'all are doing over at NativeScript. So, yeah, that's awesome. It's fun to be in the world that we're living in right now, man.
It is. It is. It's easy to take it for granted. But yeah, not to show age, but yeah, it has come a long way, and it's exciting space.
Yeah. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for the work y'all are doing at NativeScript. I may need to deploy an actual native app at some point if things are as easy as they look from your description. Maybe I am a native developer and I just never knew it. So
let us know if you need help. Thanks for NX. Yeah, really cool stuff here, Zach. Thanks.
Yeah, you got it, man. Well, thanks everyone for stopping by. We'll do another one of these next week. We're still kind of finalizing who our guests will be. Or there's a NX release coming up soon, so we may do something around there. Cheers to Den. So thanks for stopping by again,
Cheers,
sir.
Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and we'll wrap it up there. So see y'all next